It's only podcast.
Hi, how are you? This is Dr. Damaris Maria Grossman, and this is the Mindfully Integrative Show. And today we have a wonderful mindful chat with the owner of the Lilith Institute, Dvorah Green. And she is going to tell you more about herself and her story and how she is helping herself and individuals in her field and what the Lilith Institute is. So thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Damaris. I'm very excited to be here and love your whole concept. We certainly need to be more mindful and not, as I think one of your posts said, not mindless.
Yes.
It
So
doesn't
it's,
mean,
yeah,
right, it doesn't mean emptying the mind. It just means paying attention. Um,
right. And
I
it's
wrote
about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I wrote a book years ago, which was my thesis called Lilith's Fire when I first really was getting into studying her. And one of the phrases I used in that book was that we're moving from coma to consciousness, or
Oh, I
that we,
apologize, Dr. Dvorah Green.
that's fine. No, that's fine. I don't usually ask people to call me that, and it rarely comes in,
Yeah.
that handy unless you're making a reservation, as they say, and we don't do much of that anymore. So flying or
Yeah.
eating out, um, but yeah, we really, I felt that way 25 years ago, and I still feel that way that we are still moving through life in a coma often and need to be more conscious. And so, Lilith Institute was formed as I was doing my thesis, and it was really, I was so excited to first meet her because she was the first woman I'd heard about in Jewish literature or history or mythology who was completely independent. It was certainly not Eve. It was the first woman. She was the first woman in mythology, and not just in Jewish, but her
In mythology and
archetype,
other, right.
right, has carried over to Christian and Muslim, and all over the world there is this child stealing hag or witch, other ways of demonizing her. And what I wrote about was reclaiming our sacred life force. That is what Lilith's fire can give us, and that we need to realize we are all demonized in many different ways. Women are fired from jobs for doing the same thing men were doing. If there is, for example, a relationship in the workplace, they're usually the ones who get canned and not the
Mhm.
man. Even if they are the man's superior. We have had cases like that in the armed forces, the same thing, So behavior like overtly sexual behavior, which Lilith exemplifies, is applauded in men. We still have that slut and stud conundrum and
Mhm,
double
mhm.
standard, unfortunately. So I really founded this to, and my overarching goal to this day is to help women find voice. She
It's
was
so
independent.
important.
It's critical.
So say.
It's really critical. And for in the Bible to think of a woman going up against a man, I mean, it certainly did happen later in the Bible, but it's not a story we grew up hearing. And so to hear about this figure who was not only sexual but independent, free thinking, made her own decisions, took action when the situation in so called paradise Eden was intolerable because Adam expected her to submit to him in every way. And so she left. And God sent three angels to bring her back since Adam complained bitterly to God that he was lonely. And she said, I'm not coming back. And they threatened her that 100 of her children would die each night or that she would be barren. There are different stories, or that
Mm.
she'd have demon children. And so she finally struck a bargain with these angels that if you put my name up on an amulet, I don't have one here to show you, but handy, but we see them all over the world that say welcoming Adam and Eve and saying out Lilith. So the belief is very much alive still today that she can hurt pregnant women in childbirth, a baby in a crib. And to this day, people still wrap a red ribbon around cribs and wear a red bandana around their wrist to keep away the evil eye, which has sometimes she became synonymous with that concept. And so it's a very living
So
warrior.
she is, oh, in theory, she's in that trying to get rid of the evil eye. So she's part of considered evil eye. Like,
I think there's been
wow.
a lot
Wow,
of
some
crossover.
comparisons. How
Yeah.
interesting. How
Yeah,
interesting.
it is. And it's interesting to me that actually the most fundamentalist religious communities, I think, have even a stronger belief in her. And so I heard a story
Wow.
once about somebody who visited, a scholar, a professor who visited an Orthodox Jewish home for dinner in Jerusalem. And he noticed this was part of his specialty, amulets and magic. And he noticed there was a written amulet on the wall. And he said, oh, but isn't that against Lilith? Shh, they right away said. They didn't want her name spoken. And yet, as if they didn't believe in her and they denied that they did. And yet they had an amulet against her to make sure everything stayed safe.
Oh, how interesting. So they didn't believe it, but yet they must have believed it enough to
Right,
be have it present in their home.
right. Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty profound how faith, in positives and negative ways can really change in the dynamic of things.
definitely.
Yeah. And how did you grow from this? Like from the beginning, starting from there, where did you go with your Lilith Institute for yourself?
Hmm. So I started teaching classes. I was a grad student at the time, so I only was able to be very active with that for a few years. I
Hmm.
did a public women's ritual for 4 years, Rites of Spring, with the Hawaiian priestess Leilani Byerly out in California, and so it was great. And but then I decided to go for my doctorate,
Hmm.
and when that happened, everything else had to wait. And right,
I
yeah,
understand.
you understand that one. And then I started teaching. And so I came to co direct a women's spirituality program, which was at two different colleges, and then finally closed that program in 2015 and moved further north and did other things. And then, however, it became revivified, reanimated the Institute. Even though I always did some things through there, it became like my main focus, even though I was still teaching feminist philosophy and a few other things at other colleges. This has been my main focus too. I now have a women's leadership program, and I'm reanimating the Mishkan Shekhinah, which is another container in which she lives, the sacred feminine, and through which I will offer classes and workshops. So
That's
that's my main
beautiful.
work, and I also do spiritual guidance and mentorship, both spiritual and academic, which is an
That's
interesting combination.
beautiful. I
Thank
mean,
you.
so important. And you probably, the amount of work that you've written and mentored so many women, even now in today's age, I don't usually go too controversial in this podcast, but I think through all of the years, women's rights and between their, you know, here now talking about health, there's a lot of things that have come up that, it's important for us to have discussions and to have a mentor like yourself for women to have a voice.
And also, so they don't realize, so they don't think they're crazy. So they know that
Mm,
a lot of other women, for them to be in community, I think is the most important thing. So that we see we're not the only ones who think the way we do. If we think outside the box, if we're kind of at the fringe, and
mm-hmm.
definitely those issues affect our health, emotional, spiritual,
Right.
and physical. When I
Right.
was in corporate life in an urban environment and had nothing and no one to mirror back some of the things I was thinking,
Mm-hmm.
it definitely had an effect on my health. And I won't say it changed overnight. Grad school can be pretty stressful, but over the years, I learned about the values of the sacred feminine, that compassion and empathy weren't dirty words, that intuition was something we could proudly claim. I always knew I had it, but I used to know that I'd be laughed out of a corporate office, if I talked
Mm-hmm.
about that. So I might say I had a gut feeling or a hunch that this or
Gotcha.
that project should be done this way, or this
Right.
decision should happen. But so it's really nice to be in a setting, and in fact, we teach it now in a course I do called Spiritual Autobiography, the importance of accessing one's own intuition and trusting it. Somebody who's written a lot about this co taught with me in this last term, and her name is Maura McCarley Torkelson, and she wrote a book called The Inner Tree, which talks about our clairsentience, our different clairs that we may be gifted
Mhm.
with, the whole idea of intuition that everyone has it, as we know, and you certainly would
Is
know.
is
In the
it
health
depending
field.
upon if they're listening or wherever the level is? Sometimes people just suppress it too, and other people have it like all around them, correct?
Absolutely. They either suppress it or they ignore it when it
Or
comes up,
ignore it.
or they laugh it off as a coincidence. And so
Interesting.
these are among the things that I think she regards as obstacles. And so we can, and I've heard many teachers say, we can develop it.
Mhm.
But you have to trust yourself enough to do that. And the irony is that once you do trust your intuition, it feeds on itself. It becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. You trust it more and more. You make more decisions based on
You
that,
do. I could
right?
not agree with you more. If I didn't trust my inner thoughts and my inner wisdom, I would not be where I am today, even to this
Yeah,
point. Yeah, I
yeah,
completely
I'm
agree.
sure. Yeah, yeah,
I
it's not.
have a general question. Do you have men on your court that are like, on your team in the women's sacred movement that are helping too in the community, or is it all women?
I wish there were more. We used to have men sometimes in our classes who were truly
Hmm.
interested in women-centered material taught
Yeah.
by women and who weren't going to come in and try to take over the class or interrupt
Right,
everybody
right.
else.
No, in a respectful way of, or
Yeah,
even husbands of,
absolutely.
just wondering if they're, to supportive of this,
Yes.
because I know that there's years of this is
Conditioning.
a long, right, exactly.
Sure, sure.
Exactly.
Yes, and my partner works hard at it, I think, and definitely there are men married to or partnered with women I know and work with or who've studied with me who are very supportive, who have learned a lot, who really appreciate the sacred feminine because those values also live in men.
Beautiful. Yeah, no, I wonder like where like when people's view, because the sacred feminine to me it sounds beautiful. How do you can you first define the sacred feminine to those listening? Because they may not know.
Well, that's a good question
Or
and
at
a
least an
huge question.
overview for me. How about
Yes,
that?
of course. Um, it is an idea. It's an energy, it's a concept. Many people would immediately associate it with the goddess movement or the goddess or goddess without the in front of it. And she is all those things, but she's also the values. There are values that exemplify sacred feminine energy, and some of those I've mentioned now: the compassion,
Hmm.
empathy, the nurturing, which men in this culture have not been allowed to do because we're a very homophobic culture as well. So anything
Hmm.
too tender, too gentle,
Mm.
men are made fun of as being too girly, which is in itself, of course, a huge misogynistic insult,
Yeah, insult,
sexist
right,
insult.
right.
But definitely, we need the men. I just said this to my partner the other day that men need to be more involved in the anti-rape, work, because otherwise it's deleterious to their health. I think a lot of men have felt guilty in the past just because they're men by association, and so they can't deal with if a friend or a partner is raped, and it's so common as we know, violence against women, and yet only has really been more talked about in the last 10 or 15, maybe 20 years. And Me Too movement helped a lot with that. But as men begin to understand it, a good man will not be threatened by it, but they want to know more, is what I'm finding. And
Yeah.
then they can be the best support of all.
That
Yeah.
makes sense. And I think it and just I think I'm such a, looking in the gray areas of a lot of things. So it's just having that support from the good, individuals is so important. And I highlight individuals like yourself looking at different, and through another lens of a topic that could be hard for some people to maybe understand, but
Hmm.
how important a women's view and a women's rights and their thoughts can affect their whole life and their health, you know?
Absolutely. I want to add to something I just said that men could be the biggest support of all. By that I mean we need their participation to change the culture
Mm,
because we live in patriarchy, which also damages them.
gotcha.
And for every woman, it's different. For some women, they only want women in their community because of
Gotcha.
their
Gotcha.
experiences. So for them, it might be a woman who would have the greatest influence of all. But I think culturally, globally, we need both. We
Gotcha.
need.
Right. Yeah. No, I was just wondering how, kind of getting that into the right, frame of mind
No,
and
I appreciate
conversation.
the question. And there's also in many cultures, but I'll say take it from the Jewish version, and some people will talk about this as the Messiah. If we're talking about the Shekhinah, the female face of God or the female deity in Judaism, often who's been hidden, they say that figure will not return till there is peace on earth, let's say, and then the Messiah, it means the Messiah is here or Shekhinah will
Mhm.
return. But Rita Gross once wrote about this, saying that exile that she supposedly is in will end when there's equal balance between men and women. There
Mm,
is a gender balance, equality. Yeah.
inequality. I feel like we go through or um I guess it had gone up and down the last 10 years because there seemed like there's had some sort of balance a little bit.
Mm.
maybe about 5, 10 years ago. I thought there was something going on. And then now we start to see a transition. And hope, but then it's gone, so I feel like it sways. So
It's a big backlash right now.
it did. Yeah, it swayed back. So it went up and then went down.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
things do
Hope.
go in cycles, but I think
Yeah.
a lot of people feel we can't afford to keep going back, you know.
Right, backwards. Yeah, I mean I'm a big proponent of I don't think that we should be repeating any patterns, right? Whether it's history patterns, life patterns, energy patterns, and I wish we would not be repeating patterns. Or at least
Difficult.
learning from those
Let's
patterns,
say
right?
learning from them because
Learning from the
yeah,
patterns because we may repeat them, but trying
yeah,
to
do it
grow
better.
from them, grow from them, right?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah.
um is there a story that you'd like to share of your own um sacred feminine that
Hmm.
help you along the way?
Um, I
Or
will
just
say,
in general.
yeah, a couple of things. One is that it took I think the death of my husband in 91 to really
Mm.
crack me open and to
Oh my,
start
that's
to
huge.
get certain messages and be more open to spirituality, which I had deeply within me, I think, most of my life, but didn't really fully recognize or nourish because I was in a tradition in which there was a lot of patriarchal,
Hmm.
wording, male centered wording in the prayer books and so on. And so I stepped away from it and
Right,
didn't come
right.
back to it till later. And so that really cracked me open. I started reading things like Shakti Woman by Vicky Noble and Women Who Run with the Wolves, and even Dean Shinoda Boland's book on goddesses and what archetype are you? And I was just open, and I was working in corporate at the time, so that was a big shift to even pay attention
Mm.
to those things, those sources. And it made perfect sense to me because then I started reading. Oh, there's this goddess movement in California. I was in New York City at the time,
Yeah.
and I thought, well, of course, if we're made in God's image, then God has to have both male and female sides. It was like one of those minor revelations. But I kept working. I was a workaholic, and kept working in the city. And then one day, a figure kind of came out of the shadows. A homeless man. There was sort of an alleyway between two, like a huge garage and a store. It was a not industrial area, but a lot of retail. And he came out of nowhere and said, "You'll be dead in 2 years."
Mm.
Whispered this to me. And so many people would just say, well, that's the ranting of, somebody who's not mentally stable. But it
Oh
really
my
struck
goodness.
me. It really struck me because I knew I was working 10 and 12 hours a day. I didn't have a healthy lifestyle. I don't even know
Right.
that I was still going to the gym at that point. And yeah. So I took that as a sign, which I wouldn't have done maybe a few years before.
But you
Uh,
listen, you kind of, it was like, yes, it was a stranger, or maybe even a homeless person, whoever that individual was. That's a voice coming over to say, hey, what's going on in your life needs to be transitioned,
Pay
needs to
attention, pay
change. Yeah, pay
attention. I
attention,
mean,
right?
and that could have been the goddess. There's
Who
always
knows?
discussion of, you don't kill a cow in some countries because it could be an ancestor. That
Hmm.
whole thing of
Yeah.
and when and the goddess could in India, some of my friends have told me she could be in the pot that you cook the rice in. The
Mm.
goddess and spirit can show up in many forms. It's the source of life if one doesn't want to use the God language. It's
Right, right, right. If they have the one source, right. I use
right.
source a lot, spirituality. If someone doesn't want to use the word God, I understand.
Right. There is other
Okay.
language for when we experience awe and when we experience something larger than ourselves. And it's very useful when you need to turn over deep grief or despair to something other than yourself and your small view,
Small view.
relatively small
Yeah.
view. So it was enough. It was definitely one of the signs that got me thinking, okay, it's time to leave and go back to California where I had family. And that's what I did. Took a couple of years, but that's what I ultimately did, and it was absolutely the right thing. Yeah.
That's
So that's
amazing.
one little story. Yeah.
That's one little story. Yeah. I mean, I appreciate it. Like, kind of what you're doing with, identifying and talking more about women's, views in the sacred feminine and kind of having that voice because I think that even in today's world, you think that women have strong voices,
Right.
which we do. We do. But still kind of collectively keeping ourselves in that community is helpful. And how can those individuals listening and watching reach out to you?
They can write to me at Dvorah, Dvorah, at Lilith Institute, and that's Lilith Institute.com. Or they can just go to the website and they get actually, if they sign up for my, which is about a monthly newsletter, I don't
Perfect.
bombard people, they will get a mini workbook on anger as creative fire,
Mm,
which is something I think that's really important for women to know how to channel and use our anger because we have it and we've never been really allowed to have it, many women,
right.
where
Without having, some sort of negative contents to it. And
exactly.
using it in the best beneficial way, using it to be beneficial.
Exactly. And learning from its lessons, but also it can make us creative. It can,
Hmm.
make fuel projects and many things that are constructive and not destructive. In this culture, men, it's one of the few emotions men are allowed to have, and not so much women. So I want them to be able to express that, but also that comes back to voice. And the other reason it's so important is that there are many women, and this is more of the work I want to be doing, who are in abusive situations,
Mm,
whether it's dating violence or other relationship violence, and whether it's threats, verbal abuse, or whether it's outright physical. One often leads to the other, and
mm,
those women don't have a voice, and so that's why I also think, as more women talk and we meet in community,
that's
I
important.
think we
And
also believe each other more then, and you can't ever get someone out of a situation like that, but you can be there to listen and offer
that's really
resources.
important, and for them to have connections so that they know that at some point, if they need, they'll have some outlets and
They have
people
a place
around
to
and
go. Absolutely.
supportives. Yeah, that's even more important work on top of what your message here.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's true. I'm also on Instagram at Lilith Institute as much as I can.
Yeah.
And, so yeah, people can track me on there and see what I'm up to. But the Women's Leadership Program will open registration again on September 29th. So I'm excited. We just are in the middle of our first one. It's a nine
Oh,
month
that's great.
program. Yeah. And it's a really wonderful, intentionally small community in which we study a lot of topics.
Oh, awesome. Well, I really appreciate you being on the show, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
I am
Love
very
what you're
grateful.
doing. Thank
Thank
you. I am
you.
as well.
And those listening, thank you for coming on and for joining in on the Mindfully Integrative Show. And make sure you find a mindful way each and every day. Thanks so much and have a good day.